Feel free to say hey, Neil. Otherwise, you're good to stay quiet if you want. Howdy. You can use your phone speaker if you want to say hey. Well, I get, if you prefer to chat, you are totally free to do so. You may be in an area where you can't talk, so I respect that. We'll give it a few more minutes for others to join. But thanks for coming. No problem, man. Of course, hope you learned something new. Thanks for joining. We'll give it till 8:03. See if anybody else comes. Well, could just be you and I. That's fine by me. If you came to this not knowing what Clojure is or just want a better explanation, happy to stay on and give you a kind of one-on-one session, know when you can't talk. Otherwise, let me know and we can adjourn, but happy to do some teaching. So again, let me know in chat how you want to proceed. Cool. Okay. And so keep chat open because I may ask you a question or two. So hopefully you can see, I know you're on your phone. Hopefully you can see this code snippet. Let me know. But the goal, so the point here is, cool, glad you can see it. So what is Clojure? Here's a decent example. We've got a function, and there's some important parts about this function. So in this function, we are creating this label counter and initializing it to 0. And then we are returning a function, not a normal value you might expect, like true or false or a number, something like that. We're returning a function. And in that function, we are incrementing counter by 1, and then we're logging out counter. So the question is, when I come down to line 9, and I create this new variable, and I set it equal to the invocation of this function nifty. When I do that, first question is, what is stored? What is returned? Same thing here. Both of them are calling nifty. But then the next, again, interview question is, what will line 12 output to the console? What will line 13 output to the console? And what will line 15 output to the console? So I'm generally interested. Neil, care to wager a guess? You just type in 3 things separated by a comma if you want for your guesses for all 3 of these. I'll give you a minute. Take the challenge. What will line 12 output of the console? What will line 13 output of the console? And what will line 15 output of the console? It's okay. Best guess. Most educated guess. And hopefully by the end, you'll either prove yourself right or you'll have learned something. So one guess is that it will not return anything. Okay, that's a great guess. So let's run all of this and let's see what it outputs. So let me go ahead and delete this, delete that, delete that. And first, well, let's just do most of this in the console. So copy all this, come over here. You can just do it in the meetup page. Let's exit responsive mode. Make this big. Hopefully you can see all this. Let me zoom in. Okay, so let me paste the setup to all of this. So we declare our function and we declare our 2 variables. So I push enter, I have them all. And if I call closure time, it outputs 1. So line 13, or yeah, line 12, this is 1. If I do it again, so line 13, closure time, I see 2. So this is 2. And if I call alternate reality, I get 1. So 1, 2, 1. So many questions, I would hope, come to mind. Why did it not return nothing? Why didn't it give me errors? Maybe why wasn't it 1, 1, 1 or 1, 1, 2 or 0, 1, 0? A lot of things here. Hopefully the mind's starting to go. So let me do my best to explain what's happening here. So we have a function called nifty. And on line 9, I'm telling JavaScript, in this new variable closure time, I want you to store the result of executing this function nifty. And when I call nifty, what is returned? Well, let's go back to the browser here. So if I call nifty, interesting. So the console is showing me what is returned from nifty. And that is to say it returns a function. Too cool. So just as the code would have me believe, I get this function, the whole thing, back from nifty. Not the function being run or the function being called. I get the function. And that is why I can put parentheses here after I've declared closure time. So closure time as of the end of line 9 is not only a function, it is this function. So hopefully that makes more sense now. So good, no problem in knowing when I call these parentheses, when I call this, I'm not calling Nifty, I'm calling the function that was returned from Nifty. Awesome that makes more sense. Okay, so next question is, why doesn't this give me an error? And I asked that question because the most sensible thing for a decent programmer is to be aware of this concept of garbage collection. And that is, when a program runs or when a function runs, it is added to the call stack, a new execution context is created, the function is run, and then you get something back. So whatever's returned is given back to us, and hopefully we store that in a variable. But it's everything inside the function from there on is destroyed. The computer forgets about it completely. So anyone coming to this should think, when Nifty is done running, I'm saving this, I'm returning this function, but this should be garbage collected, meaning it was only in the function and I don't bring it back, I only bring this back. So counter goes away, we would think, which would then lead me to believe when I call the function here, when I run line 12, and this function is run, why don't I get an error saying, I have no idea what counter is? Because by now it should have been garbage collected, and counter should have only been available within the scope of Nifty. So here we are in this function that was returned, removed from the scope of Nifty, and it should know, like, this should be an error. It should say, I don't know what counter is, because I don't see it anywhere. It wasn't declared here, so I don't know what it is. You'd think there would be an error. And calling it again, you would think there would be an error too, or in fact, it would never even get past this line because you just get an error and your script would break. So why isn't it giving us an error? And not even that, better, it's hopefully giving us what we want. Oh, the junior beginner programmer might think we have counter here, I am adding 1 to counter, and then I'm logging it. So this will be 1. And then I call this again, counter was 1, I'm adding 1 to it, it's 2, and I'm logging it. So of course it's 2. And that junior new programmer wouldn't be aware of garbage collection. And it turns out they would just somehow have this weird, wonderfully novice mental state of not realizing that they're understanding closure. So closure is a function's ability to remember variables, other functions, anything that existed in the scope that it was originally made in, that it was returned from. So closure is the technological marvel that brings counter with it. Bring that when this function returns, because counter is being referenced in the function, JavaScript is smart enough to more or less put a little backpack on this function and know to put in that backpack this variable counter. And then when it adds 1 to counter, it looks up counter in that very specific place, that backpack, that is also called closure. So it's multiple terms, but JavaScript smart enough knew to bring that backpack with it and to put counter in it. So counter, it knows what it is because it's in that backpack. Because this function, closure just means it closed over. So this function closed over the content inside of the outer wrapping function. So when we come to closure time and we try to call it, it goes to this line. And because of closure, it knows what counter is. Counter was 0. It adds 1 to it. And now counter is 1. And when we call it again, that backpack still holds counter, and that counter is now 1. So We add 1 to 1, and we get 2. The reason that alternate reality is 1 and maybe not 3, or also not a bug or 0, is every time we call Nifty, we get back the same function, but it's not the same function as here. Both of these return different backpacks, if you will. So line 9, closure time gets its own backpack that has its own counter that's set to 0. Alternate reality, we call this function again, but the function return is a completely different function, totally unaware of closure time, but it also gets a backpack with counter as 0. So they both get their own backpacks, completely unaware of each other. And therefore, when we call alternate reality, that one's counter is still 0. We add 1 to it, and we get 1. So hopefully this is starting to make more sense, but this notion of returning a function, and in the body of that function, if it refers to a variable that existed or exists outside of that function, but inside the function that is calling it. So we have this function is the outer scope, and from inside that, we are returning this function. Let's say we have let foo equal false. So not to really screw things up here, but JavaScript is also smart enough to know, because we don't refer to foo anywhere in this function, it won't put foo in that backpack. As soon as we say something like foo equals true, now JavaScript will know, oh, I got to bring foo along too, make sure I remember that. But if we don't, if foo was just used to calculate some other value and you had hundreds of variables in here, it wouldn't have done that. So if I call alternate reality again, it will return 2 because you're increasing the value in alternate reality. That is exactly correct. So in fact, if we come back in here and I call alternate reality again, I do indeed get 2. Because again, it's got its own backpack as where. So rock on. I think you're getting it. So yeah, that in a sense, at its very basic, is closure. Closure, if you're in an interview and someone says define closure, the most simple answer is it is a function's ability to remember its scope when it was returned. It's its ability to remember this environment, the environment of Nifty, even though when we actually call this function, the contents of it, and it's removed completely from this function's environment. So it's a function's ability to remember certain variables from when it was declared, which is a really, really handy feature. Does any of this change if you declare counter with const? No, it does not. It does only because, so that's I guess a different topic. When it comes to const, this has nothing to do with closure. If I set counter to 0 and then I try to increment counter, what this is really doing in JavaScript is not adding 1 to 0. A number is a primitive value type in JavaScript. It's actually reassigning to counter the number that is the equivalent of 0 plus 1. So that's the only reason why const won't work, because you literally can't reassign something to const. But that has nothing to do with closure. So I just did let. You could do var, you could do let. If it was an object, you could do, so I could say const person equals an object, name, Robert, sorry. So I could say person dot name, and then I could do equals Bob, and const is totally fine with you changing the object. You just can't reassign it. So again, nothing really to do with closure. Good question, but ultimately, yeah. So that was quick. That was short. Hopefully, no more about closure. It more or less happens everywhere. So any framework you're using, you're probably dealing with closure, higher order functions, which are functions being returned. So Nifty is a higher order function because it returns a function. And whenever you're returning a function from another function, you're likely taking advantage of closure. So feel free to look through your code, look through other code, anywhere that you see returning a function, and nowadays functions might look something like this, which is totally fine too. It's just the ES6 syntax of it. Anywhere you see something like that, odds are closure is involved. And again, closure is the ability for a function to remember its enclosing scope long after that enclosing scope has been garbage collected. So Nifty runs, this function has access to this variable that was only in Nifty, and because of closure, it's got a little backpack that has a reference to that thing. And that backpack is like a private variable for that function only. So rock on. Hope this helped. Good questions. And yeah, feel free to put in the chat anything else, but rock on, yeah. And later, if I put this video online for others, hopefully you enjoyed this, but you know, it was for Neil and I. Neil and I had a personal time. Enjoy the evening, Neil. Thanks for joining. Sorry I couldn't chat, but thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy future lessons. Cheers, man. Bye, everybody.